Good morning, everybody. This is welcome to the current installment of MishBio U. The topic today is crushing complexity in regulatory and manufacturing-driven development, and it's going to be presented by Gene Paranak, Managing Director at Into Being, a member company based in Saline, Michigan. As always, just a reminder that these webinars are recorded and available for members through the member portal. If you have any questions, give us a call and we'll be happy to connect you to the recording of your choice. Also, a heads up that our next webinar is scheduled for April 24th. It's going to be focused on intellectual property in China, and it will be presented by our member law firm, LeClaire Ryan. As always, these and other events are posted in our BioLink newsletter that we send out through emails, as well as being on the MishBio events calendar. So now it's a pleasure for me to turn the session over to Gene, who's going to walk you through the presentation. Gene, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate being here. And thanks to you and Elizabeth and the rest of your staff for all the behind-the-scenes stuff to make these and other MishBio U's happen. Well, I'm showing my screen now. Is that showing up correctly on your end from what you can see, Stephen?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Gene Paranak, Managing Director of Into Being. We're going to be talking about crushing complexity in regulatory and manufacturing-driven development. Going to the next slide, just a quick word about myself, if the slide will switch. I'm the founder and Managing Director of Into Being. I sit on 3 MedTech funding and oversight committees in the state of Michigan. We've got a lot of thanks to give to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, folks like Fred Molnar and Denise Graves, who are behind a lot of these entrepreneurial pushes to bring med devices and MedTech in concert with groups like MishBio. And I was an early HandyLab team member. We exited for $275 million to Becton Dickinson with a molecular diagnostic package. And I have 24 issued patents. I have 8 awesome kids and 1 even more awesome spouse. I'm very thankful for my wife. And a little bit of interest piece here. I was the first person last year to fly a powered paraglider across the state of Michigan, water to water. So here's a couple pictures from that, but our Michigan roots run deep. And now we've seen the entire state from about 1,000 feet up. So as the package that went around earlier talked about in the blurb that went around for this session, you know, the road to product success is littered with failed companies. They had great plans, they had good funding, they had awesome people. Where did they go wrong? And the answers are many, and you can post-mortem something many different ways. But the thing that we want to focus on today is the question of complexity. That's what we're here to talk about. What is it? How do we identify it? And most importantly, how do we address it in real-life product development? Let me take you back to my childhood really quick. Around the holidays, when we'd visit my grandparents' house, there'd always be a big bowl of nuts. I guess if you had a severe nut allergy, it wasn't a good place to be. But there was a big carved wooden bowl of nuts that would always be on the table in the dining room or the living room. And in it would be some nutcrackers. And as kids or the adults, the parents would go and crack the nuts and scattering the shells all around, we would eat what was inside. There would be pecans, there would be English walnuts, there would be almonds, and others. Always enjoyed that. But one nut that was really never in that bowl was actually my grandfather's favorite nut. It was a black walnut. Now, if you know anything about the difference between black walnuts and English walnuts, this is a picture of a black walnut. It has a thick, fibrous green husk on it that's very hard to get through. Beneath that, it has a hard and thick shell. It takes usually a vise to crush one of these, whereas the English walnuts you're used to can be cracked with that nice little device that you just saw earlier. These are my grandfather's favorite kind of nut before he passed. One year, he was visiting us in Michigan, and he saw that we had a black walnut tree in the backyard. And he said, I'll give you, I think it was 25 cents a pound, if you will dehusk, crack, and extract the sweet essence from these black walnuts. Well, he knew what he was getting me into, and I didn't. It turns out to get that nut out of a black walnut, you have to let these things sit in the sun underneath the screen so that the squirrels don't get them. Once they've melted to that sort of brown state in the middle, you have to kick at them with your shoes until the husks come off. And after that, you have to dry the nuts. And after you dry them, you have to sit down at the kitchen table with a vise and crack these things open and pick the meat out. It's a long process. So if I say to you, what does it take to crack a walnut? Well, depends what kind of a walnut you're thinking about. And this is an analogy for what we would consider to be complex systems. Systems that are very unknowable from the outside. You have to get into them. You have to see how the parts of the system gives rise to the collective behaviors of the system. And you get an emergent behavior out of it that's hard to define at the outset. What does it take to crack a walnut? Well, it depends. Here are some characteristics of a complex system. They have indirect effects. Causes and effects are not clearly related. Pushing something here moves something over there. They're interdependent, and they have really nonlinear behaviors that are hard to predict. Well, the standard management technique for developing almost any product is usually a siloed method. An initial plan is put in place, silos are created, roles are filled, seats are filled, and each does their job. You have management, you have employees, you have consultants, you have vendors, you have marketing, you have stakeholders of other types. And then the hope and the expectation is that this will all work together and we will get a device out the other end. Rarely does this work in the way that's expected. Well, just a word about IntuBeing. IntuBeing develops medical devices for innovative companies. So we have a front row seat for this process as it dovetails, often in the form of virtual companies, with startups and larger medical device companies. Over the years, we've talked heavily about what we like to call the four forces working on a medical device development company. Everyone's obsessed with the technical possibilities of what can be done, which forms the top of our compass rose. Many folks are concerned about the intellectual property landscape, as they should be, and that forms the eastern part of our rose. The southern point, we have market requirements, which we're very thankful for programs out there like the NSF I-Corps and others, which are focusing people on asking really hard market questions instead of just saying, I've got a great product and it's going to sell like wildfire. So people are focusing on how to answer those market questions. And on the west end, we've got the regulatory process. Every startup, every product company that's doing medical devices has to balance all four of these forces all the way through their product's development process. And along the way, they'll discover that novelty is sometimes an asset and sometimes a liability. The IP landscape, the more novel you can be, the better it is. Your market will eat up the novelty. But from a technical development standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint, novelty can often be a liability. This is the foundation that we come to this sort of question of complexity with. What I want to introduce to you now is another framework to look at complexity. We're going to look at it first at a theoretical level, then we're going to start to apply it to real-world challenges. This is called the Cynefin framework, and if that word doesn't look like Cynefin to you, it also doesn't to me. It's a Welsh word from my understanding, and the term was coined by a gentleman by the name of David Snowden. You can get to his work at the website you see on your screen. I recommend that you check it out. He bins 4 areas that we should consider, and this can be applied to whole projects, this can be applied to the regulatory space, it can be applied to the development space, it can be applied to almost any challenge you're facing, big or small. In the bottom right quadrant, we have what we would consider obvious challenges. These can be addressed with best practices. We can sense, we can categorize, and we can respond. Oh, I need some engineering. Oh, I need some regulatory. Oh, I need this, I need that. Once I've put people in those spots, everything's going to work fine. Well, as we already discussed, that's not usually how new product development works. But this is the way that our minds frequently approach a problem. See what's there, put things in place to address it, and somehow we're going to succeed. Well, that's not the whole story. complicated. This allows for good practices, but it's hard to reduce to best practices when you're in the complicated domain. You have to sense where you are. You've got to analyze where you are because it might not be what it seems at first glance, and then you have to respond. This is still under control, but it's a less definitive part of the matrix. As we move to the left side, we get into the complex domain, where the only real way to solve problems is to probe, to sense the results of that probe, and then to respond to it. This gives rise to emergent practices, meaning that one problem to the next problem you won't necessarily handle in exactly the same way. One company to the next company you won't necessarily handle in exactly the same way. And this is where it starts to get tricky for traditional management styles and traditional approaches where we just throw people and money at the problem. Finally, there's the chaotic domain. This is where none of us want to be. And you're fully in the realm of novel practices. You have to try something. You have to see what the result is, and then you have to respond. It's very, very hard to predict timelines and costs when you're in the chaotic regime. But as you can probably see, every problem you run into can be placed into one of these boxes. Research is often the domain of the chaotic regime. It's not a place we want to be when we're doing a startup, creating a medical device. We truly want to be in development. On the right side, the classic management styles really tend to use an obvious approach to things. They put roles in place and kind of hope for the best. The reality is that product development and novel product development, which is all of our interest, generally lives in the complicated and complex domains where good practices and emergent practices exist, but not really best practices. And this is a challenging thing to wrap your head around. So step one is really to admit that we have a problem, to recognize that most of these challenges that we run into don't require academic research to solve, and they're not going to fall down when we just put the right people in the right places. They actually require what we would consider to be a probe, sense, and respond approach. So step two is we have to be ready to probe things. We have to be ready to test bed things instead of just pouring gas on the fire. A classic response to these kinds of challenges is that we'll just throw bodies at it. We'll just throw money at it. But in reality, the way that you break this down is you probe and then you respond. Let's talk about some specifics then. Here are some common complexity challenges that folks run into and their solutions. We'll start with the regulatory domain. And here, if you've heard any of our other presentations, you'll know that the difference between your market claims and what your predicate device is laying out can be a big stumbling block for companies. Everyone wants to sell a novel market-changing device, but the burden of proof for a novel market-changing device versus one that's just me too, it can be greatly increased. So these challenges can range from obvious to complex. When we say, what is my regulatory pathway? This may be very cut and dried, or it may be something that really requires a probe, sense, respond approach. So what are some of the antidotes to this? Well, I think people are becoming cognizant that getting a regulatory analysis done is a good first step when you're thinking about bringing a medical device to market, and we would recommend that as well. But a regulatory analysis by itself will usually fall short. It'll give you a snapshot, a moment in time of what you told your analyst and what they interpreted it as, and it will give you some useful information about where your device might be classified, how it might be classified, and some of the standards you have to comply with. What you don't know at that moment in time is whether the FDA agrees. And there are processes out there for confirming that with FDA. So some of the antidotes to this, again, in a probe, sense, respond context, are things like the 513G program, or later on, the Q-sub, or some people call it the pre-sub program with FDA, where you can actually get feedback. So you're not just relying on some expert's advice as to where they think this is classified. You're actually going to FDA with information before your final submission and saying, this is what we're going to do. How do you feel about it? And that gives you a much firmer foundation to stand on. So there's one example of a probe, sense, respond pattern used for regulatory. Let's look at the manufacturing process. Everyone knows that manufacturing can be a big challenge for medical devices. And some of those challenges are simple feasibility. I built something on a bench in a lab, and I want to replicate it. There's a particular material out there that many folks will know called PDMS, polydimethylsiloxane, and it's used at an academic scale for prototyping many, many kinds of devices. It's almost entirely useless at a manufacturing scale. And so manufacturing feasibility for that or other devices becomes something that really is a challenge. There's another challenge, which is if we need to sell our first 1,000 devices for, let's say, $1 per device, but right now it costs me $100 per device to make it, that cost reduction pathway versus my scaling requirements can be a real hurdle to overcome. It may be possible to build it long-term for $1 a piece, but I have to hit the volumes that would justify it. These can range from obvious, simple problems to overcome, but for more complex devices and more novel devices, they tend to become complex or sometimes even chaotic solutions that can unpack the entire design all the way down to the roots. Some of the antidotes to this, well, one is early manufacturing engagement. A mistake that a lot of folks make is to go to a manufacturer and expect them to be able to quote exactly what it's going to take to build their product. Well, you have to show first. You have to show exactly what it is that you're thinking of doing. Then you start to get feedback from the manufacturer. As you start that relationship and that process, you'll start to get suggestions, designed for manufacturability and other things like that. You need to keep your process options open. We once had a client come to us and tell us that the product wasn't designed, but they had already picked a manufacturer. But that's not the way that you're going to get to success quickly. We've also had folks who attempted to approach manufacturers before they had enough information to share. And this can be a danger as well, because the manufacturer just looks at a PowerPoint and says, well, it's a nice idea, I could help you, but I need you to define the manufacturing package. And so it's that early engagement, but not expecting too much in the early phases, that allows you to grow those relationships and allows you to define your product along the way. Here's our third example. This is one that most people don't really see at the outset. This is standards and guidances. Many folks know that there are standards out there, international consensus standards. There are also guidances from FDA. And oftentimes you'll receive a regulatory analysis and it will say, well, you need to comply with this standard. But what does that really mean? How do we comply with a standard? I think there's a belief going around that standards are test tube standards, that we can design our device and submit it to a test house and they will show that it meets the standard. But the reality, especially if you forget up front about this nuance, is that this can send you into large amounts of redesign if you haven't built those standards in and their specifics from the very start. So the antidotes to this kind of a challenge, first of all, do we have all the standards, regulations, and guidances that are needed? Next, do we understand all the standards, regulations, and guidances that are needed? And thirdly, when is the appropriate time for us to unpack those standards clause by clause? When you get down into the details of many of these standards, like the one shown in the upper right corner of the screen, which is the IEC 60601 family of standards relating to electrical safety and basic safety for medical devices, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages with thousands of clauses. Each one of those clauses at some level needs to be evaluated as to whether it is applicable to your device, and if so, the level of applicability and the way that it will be applied needs to be understood. For your specific device, finding the appropriate time can be a challenge. Do you analyze it all right at the outset? Do you analyze it in process? That's something that needs to be discussed and the risks weighed. Another place that is on people's radar much of the time is patents and intellectual property. Everyone knows that the existing patent landscape and the questions of patentability are gigantic for startups and new medical devices. So the common solutions, the common antidotes are patentability analysis. We probe what's out there. We find out, is this going to be patentable? We can do a freedom to operate analysis and find out, do we have space to move? But there's an interesting nuance here that has come up in many cases, where you're focused on your core technology and you're asking the question, can I patent my core technology? Am I free to operate in my core technology? But sometimes it's not the core technology that's the hangup. It's the supporting technology. A great example is safety needles. There are requirements for things like peripheral IV catheters that there be a safety needle to protect after withdrawal of the needle. What's not commonly known is that this is frequently a custom and proprietary mechanism. So oftentimes, folks find themselves in a place where they need to design a supporting solution, and that's when they find themselves bound up by the IP question. It's not the core, it's the supporting solutions that can really get you in trouble sometimes. So the antidote is to probe early and often. Do we really have access to all the technology we need? Not just the core technology, but also the supporting technology. Our next example is on the whole question of timeline. Timeline and responsiveness. Everyone knows that it's a challenge to get a Gantt chart and reality to match up. This can be complicated and it can be chaotic. Some of the antidotes, some of these are common to project management in general. Gating dates. Do we truly understand the critical path for our product? A great example of this is testing. If you intend to submit your medical device to a test house, you may think that you can just walk up, place it in the door, and 4 weeks later you'll have your test results. In addition to the test timelines often taking longer than a month, many times it will take 2 or even 3 months to get in queue for the test house. So are we aware of any major queues? Are we focused on the gating dates? Are we recognizing that certain steps have to be completed before other steps? And an often missed point is the quoting and the contracting timeline. The inability to simply walk in and turn a particular service on, it takes time, and you have to acknowledge that timeline. That can be a month, that can be 2 months, but rarely are quoting and contracting same day or same week processes. Well, some other challenges to think about, and we won't unpack these in great detail, but if there are any questions, we can address them. A place where we've seen these kinds of complexity challenges arise is with the addition of stakeholders in a process. Either a new advisor comes to a project, a new consultant, or marketing discovers something new that the customer would really like to have. These all serve as additional stakeholders, and they create a challenge that has to be addressed because what's being asked is we're going to change the scope in midstream. Well, sometimes you have to address that. Sometimes it is necessary. But the probe, sense, respond process is to ask, how will this affect our process and how will it affect our timeline? To not make those commitments before we're sure that we're ready to bite off whatever additional effort that's going to take. Finally, one more, and that's on reimbursement. This is a growing area for med devices that people are truly recognizing and starting to embrace. Rather than changing the reimbursement process, which was a strategy that folks often talked about some years ago, people are acknowledging that you have to understand how your device is going to fit into the billing landscape. The CPT codes and the group purchasing organizations that will often purchase these devices for hospital systems have to be understood. And that's a place for early probes with demo devices as well as potential marketing materials to get out there and find out how the market will respond. So in summary, novel medical device development It's a complex endeavor. If you treat it as obvious or chaotic as a research project or as a turn the crank project, it will result in failure. And the primary solution method in that complex domain is to probe. You make little trials. You sense the response of those trials, and then you respond to it. We reviewed about 5 areas where probe, sense, respond is absolutely critical. And hopefully that gives you just a little flavor for how to approach these challenges you run into. The solution is rarely to just say, let's throw bodies and money at it. The solution is usually to probe the situation, to sense whether that probe is heading in the right direction, and then to respond with a strategy change. So at In2Being, we work with a bunch of devices and device companies at various endpoints. Concept, which to us means a functional prototype. Another endpoint is clinical trials with Institutional Review Board and investigational device exemption appropriate design controls, as well as commercialization with 510K or other clearance appropriate design controls. We work in a bunch of different technical domains: fluidics, mechanical, optics, electronics, documentation, automation, software, and vendor management. And that's the end of our presentation. We hope that this helps to give you a bridge to where you're trying to get to. So thank you, and thank you to MischBio for your time today.
Gene, thanks so much. Excellent presentation, very informative. I'll open it up for questions now. Well, seeing none, we'll wrap that up. Again, the recording will be available through the member portal on MischBio's website. And our next upcoming webinar will be April 24th. Keep a lookout for our emails, newsletters, and events calendar to tell you how to register for that webinar and all of our other events. So thank you again, Gene. Greatly appreciate all the knowledge that you passed along this morning.
Thank you, Stephen. We appreciate being here.
That concludes today's MischBio U session. Thank you.